Chapter 20 of Aristopia by Castello, Newton, Holford. Charles Morton was elected governor of Aristopia for 3 successive terms of 5 years each, and then declined another term. He believed the political principles held so dear by the founder of the Commonwealth had become so firmly embedded in the institutions and public life of Aristopia that they were in little danger of ever being eradicated, and he wished the people to become accustomed to a change of executives, and above all that they should not come to consider the office to be hereditary. So he was pleased when a person not a member of his family was elected as his successor. Members of the family, however, had become members of Congress, and one of them was a judge of the Supreme Court of the Commonwealth. Governor Charles Morton, not long after his first election, began gradually to give up the free transportation of immigrants, and to dispose of the many vessels his father had employed for that purpose. Very many people would come to Aristopia at their own expense, and the inhabitants of the Commonwealth could well assist many of their poor relatives to come over. After he had retired from the governorship, he rendered the Commonwealth a service which, although it seemed small at first, became very great a generation afterward. The colonists had introduced sheep as soon as they had clearings sufficient for sheep pastures, not too much exposed to the wolves. But circumstances were unfavourable for an improvement of the breed, which became inferior. In England, more favourable circumstances had enabled breeders to develop much improved breeds. But the jealous landowners had procured the enactment of laws forbidding the exportation of sheep on penalty of having the right hand cut off, and exportation did not offer sufficient profit to induce an ordinary individual to risk the terrible penalty. Ex-Governor Morton employed the captain of a privateer with a strong, bold crew to make an importation of Cotswold sheep. One of his agents in England rented a wild piece of land on the western coast of England for a pasture, and brought there more than 100 Cotswold ewes and a few of the finest bucks to be obtained. One day, toward evening, the rover appeared off this coast. At night the crew landed, provided with a launch or flatboat large enough to take off all the sheep. The coastguard were on the watch, thinking the vessel a smuggler. They attacked the crew while the latter were in the act of loading the sheep, but the crew was far stronger than the guard expected, and the attack was easily repulsed. The sheep were safely loaded, and before daylight the bold rover was out of sight of the English coast. The sheep were duly landed, the captain of the rover receiving £3,000 for his venture. The flock was carefully nursed and increased rapidly, so that in time they supplied not only Aristopia but the other American colonies with a much improved breed, adding millions of dollars to the wealth of America. Charles Morton took from the mine all the gold which was easily accessible, placing all he did not use for current expenses in the Bank of Amsterdam. Before his death, which occurred when he was about 80, he gave $5,000 to each of his living sons and daughters, and to each family of the 2 who had died. He left in the Bank of Amsterdam $3 million, which, with the accrued interest, was to be used by the Commonwealth at a certain crisis, which he foretold in a letter which he had the governor read and then seal up and reserve for his successor. Each governor of Aristopia on his accession was to open and read this letter, and then seal it and leave it for his successor, first solemnly promising never to reveal the contents of the letter until the crisis should arrive, when he was to draw upon the fund and use it for the Commonwealth. In the war between England and France from 1744 to 1748, Aristopia had to defend itself vigorously against the French, who had become considerably numerous in the western part of Canada, and their Indian allies. The posts on the route to the copper mines had to be strongly fortified, and the vessels on Lake Michigan heavily armed. But Aristopia was 10 times as strong as all New France, and the Aristopians captured the forts of the French at Mackinac and Detroit, and easily routed their Algonquin allies. The French never were able to seduce the Ojibways, Saukes, and Foxes from their friendship to the Aristopians. Aristopia also sent 1,000 soldiers to the assistance of New England in the war. Immediately after the close of this war, commerce between Aristopia and the new French colony of Louisiana, which began before the war, very greatly increased. The annoying and oppressive restrictions laid by the English Parliament on American manufactures and commerce stimulated this commerce with Louisiana, until in a few years Aristopia almost abandoned its commerce by its Atlantic port, Mortonia. Manufactures in the colonies, if not absolutely forbidden, were very much restricted by the prohibition to carry any article manufactured in one plantation into another or to any other country. The colonies had now to deal not with the king alone, nor even with Parliament alone, but with the merchant and landlord class of England. Great Britain was governed by a parliament of merchants and landowners, and English legislation was surrendered to the traders' and the landlords' selfish and short-sighted greed of gain. The exports of Aristopia to Louisiana consisted of flour, potatoes, oats, lumber, furs and pelts, wool, shoes, nails and other heavy iron manufactures, and wooden ware. Its imports were sugar, tea, rice, lemons, fine cloths, needles, pins, thread, buttons, fine cutlery, watches, musical instruments, etc. As the exports were much more heavy and bulky than the imports, more shipping was needed to carry them. Thus, while the imports were brought up the Mississippi and Ohio on horseboats, much of the exports were floated down on flatboats, rudely and cheaply constructed, which were broken up and sold for lumber at New Orleans. Some of the flatboatmen returned home on the horseboats, but most of them by land, as the distance from New Orleans to the Ohio overland was only about half that by river, and the horseboats made slow progress upstream against the powerful current. If these flatboatmen had belonged to any other community, they would have been left to find their way home through the wilderness as best they could, each man for himself. But they were engaged in the business of the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth cared carefully for them. A route was surveyed, and a good path cleared through tangled thickets and canebrakes. Creeks and morasses were bridged with commodious footlogs. On streams too wide to be bridged, boats were placed for ferriage. At every 20 miles on the route a strong log house was built, where parties of boatmen might sleep, secure from savages and sheltered from storms. At 2 points on the route posts were established and garrisoned, where the travellers could replenish their stock of food for the journey. These places also served as posts for the purchase of furs from the Indians. Another war in which the American colonies took part broke out in 1755 between England and France for the possession of Canada. Aristopia was in principle opposed to a war of conquest, but such was the animosity of the French in Canada, such their persistency in striving to incite the Indians against all the English colonies, and their determination to prevent any further extension of those colonies, that Aristopia saw that in self-defence the French must be driven from the upper lakes. A strong land force, co-operating with heavily armed vessels from Lake Michigan, captured all the French posts as far east as Niagara, sent the soldiers prisoners into the eastern part of Aristopia, and disarmed all the French settlers. The Commonwealth also sent 5,000 well-drilled, well-armed, and well-equipped soldiers to assist New England and New York. Along the St. Lawrence, the French were much stronger than in the west, and the Atlantic colonies were not nearly so strong as Aristopia. Therefore the war lingered in the east for several years, until finally the French were entirely overcome. Peace between England and France was declared, and all Canada and the region east of the Mississippi, except a small part of Louisiana, were ceded to England. During all this war Aristopia maintained its trade with New Orleans, keeping a sort of tacit truce with the French of Louisiana, while actively fighting those of Canada. The trade of Aristopia was valuable to Louisiana. The governor of that province had fully informed himself of the overwhelming strength of Aristopia, and was glad of the opportunity of avoiding a hopeless contest with the great northern Commonwealth. At the beginning of this war occurred the tragedy of the exile of the Acadians, a colony of about 7,000 French in the western part of the peninsula lying east of the Bay of Fundy. The English having conquered this region, the authorities thought it too much trouble and expense to watch the inhabitants, and did not want them to retire to Quebec to reinforce the French there. So it was determined to deport all the inhabitants of Acadia. The dreadful business was carried out implacably. After being held prisoners some time, the Acadians were driven at the point of the bayonet on terribly crowded transports to be distributed among the English colonies. In many cases fathers were separated from their children and husbands from their wives. Before leaving their beloved homes, the Acadians had the grief to see them burned by the English soldiers. Their well-cultivated lands, their recently gathered harvests, and their numerous livestock became the plunder of the English officials. The news of this deportation and the separation of the Acadians was quickly carried to Aristopia, where it created the greatest indignation and sympathy for the unfortunates. Congress happened to be in session. An appropriation was immediately made to bring as many of the Acadians as possible to Aristopia. The English intended to send the greater part of them to Massachusetts, but on arriving there the people refused to receive them. They shrank in horror from the Popish dogs, and the countrymen of those who had incited the Indians to such atrocious massacres as those of Cohico and Haverhill. Nor was New York, which had passed a law to hang every Catholic priest who ventured into the colony, any more hospitable to the exiles. With Aristopia it was far different. A large part of its population was Catholic, and another large part of French origin. With its compact and formidable settlements on its northern frontier, it had suffered little from Indian war, and had no memories of massacres to keep hatred alive. Most of the Acadians were brought to Aristopia. The Mortons, descendants of the first governor of Aristopia, imbued with the spirit of their ancestor, headed subscriptions for means to seek out such heads of families as had been sent to other colonies while their wives and children had reached Aristopia, and unite them with their families. In the fraternal Commonwealth the anguished exiles found a quiet asylum. But the government of Aristopia took care not to settle them so far west that they would come in contact with their countrymen in Canada or Louisiana, to whom they might be too partial. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Aristopia by Castello Newton Holford. At the close of the war, England began an increased taxation of the colonies to defray its expenses. Intense dissatisfaction was produced as one tax after another was levied. The Americans now saw that it was no longer the King and Parliament, but the electors of Parliament, who were bent on oppressing them. Every village shopkeeper and country squire in England began to talk of the taxes which ought to be imposed on "our subjects in America." Seeing this, the Americans began to think of separation, and talk of armed resistance. Aristopia did her best to encourage the other colonies to resistance, for she determined that the time for independence had almost arrived. She began to drill great numbers of militia, establish foundries for cannon, and factories for muskets and powder. In some great caverns in Kentucky, saltpetre in immense quantities had been discovered. Aristopia could manufacture powder, importing only the sulphur. The population of the Commonwealth in 1774 had become fully 4 millions. The immigration, by the immense expenditures of Ralph Morton, had been such as the world had never seen elsewhere. The circumstances of life were so favourable that the natural increase of the colony by the excess of births over deaths was sufficient to double the population every 30 years or less, exclusive of immigration. The suppression of the smallpox by vaccination was sufficient of itself to give the Commonwealth an immense advantage over other countries. The population of other English colonies, exclusive of Canada, was a little less than 2½ millions. Aristopia had doubtless drawn off some people who, but for her, would have gone to the Atlantic colonies, but most of her immigrants were those who would never have reached America without her aid: the Irish, the poor peasants of England, Scotland, and the western shores of the continent, the people of the far inland regions, Eastern Germany, Bohemia, Poland, Austria, Switzerland, Savoy, Lombardy, and Venice, who would not have come to America but for the far-reaching and effective Morton agencies. Aristopia, for convenience of administration of public affairs, had been divided into 6 states: Allegheny, extending from the crest of the Allegheny Mountains on the east to the Allegheny, Ohio, and Big Sandy rivers on the west; Ohio, bounded on the east and south by the Allegheny River and Ohio River, and on west by the 84th meridian; Columbia, extending from the 84th meridian to the Wabash River; Illinois, lying between the Wabash and the Mississippi; Missouri, extending from the Mississippi indefinitely westward; and Kentucky, including all of Aristopia lying south of the Ohio and west of the Big Sandy River. The nominal boundaries of Aristopia were the 38th parallel on the south and the 41st parallel on the north, but there were many settlements of Aristopia beyond those lines, especially in Kentucky. The population of Allegheny was more than 1 million, and that of Ohio nearly 1 million. Each of these states had a governor and a legislature with limited legislative powers for local government. The chief executive of the Commonwealth was now called the Governor-General. In popular education, the condition of agriculture, and the mechanical arts, Aristopia was far in advance of the Atlantic colonies, and in some respects of England. Virginia, although the most populous of the Atlantic colonies except only Massachusetts, was the most backward in civilization. No improvement could be expected from her frontiersmen, living in semi-barbarism, and little from her aristocratic and indolent planters, and, of course, none at all from the abject white servants and still more abject black slaves of the planters. The colony had a college or two for the sons of rich planters, but few public schools for the common people, and only 2 or 3 printing presses. All the other Atlantic colonies south of Pennsylvania were like Virginia, although in a less degree. In Massachusetts improvement was checked by another cause: religious bigotry and superstition. Although there were printing presses and public schools in the colony, the teaching, beyond the merest rudiments of English, was only Latin and theology. One of their own writers on the agriculture of New England before the Revolution says, "The man who ventured to try experiments was looked on with displeasure. If one did not plant just as many acres of corn as his father did, and that, too, in the old of the moon; if he did not sow just as much rye to the acre and use the same number of oxen to the plough; if he did not hoe as many times as his father and grandfather did, if, in short, he did not adopt the same views and prejudices his father had done, he was shunned in the company of old and young, and looked on as a visionary." They had near them a fair example of progress in the Dutch settlers of the Hudson and Mohawk valleys, whose industry was so well seconded by ingenuity and improvement as to lead to great comfort and prosperity. But the Puritans carefully avoided profiting by the example. When shown any ingenious device for agricultural, mechanical, or household use, the New Englander was accustomed to say, "It beats the Dutch." While he said aloud, "It beats the Dutch," he thought to himself, "It beats the devil," for to his mind Satan was the father of innovations. It was not until near the Revolution that the crust of bigotry was broken and the New England mind began to expand, and Yankee ingenuity began to beat the Dutch. The strong reaction which followed the witchcraft delusion was the dawning of the day after the night of bigotry and superstition in New England. The one thing in which the Puritans appear to have made an innovation was in sawing lumber. Somewhere about 1640, sawmills, then unknown in England, were introduced into Massachusetts. Some of the Puritans had seen sawmills driven by water power during their exile in Germany, and, strange to say, did not consider them a device of Satan to enslave men's souls. In Aristopia every public school had a large library of books of useful knowledge, and every child attended school for 12 or 15 years, studying not Latin and theology, but mathematics, geography, astronomy, and what was then known of chemical science. Improvement was a matter of course, and innovation which promised improvement was welcomed. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Aristopia by Castello Newton Holford. The storm cloud of revolution grew darker and darker during the year 1774 and the first months of 1775. Boston was the storm centre. The stubborn and rebellious colony of Massachusetts had always been most prominent in resistance to royal and parliamentary interference with its government. A strong garrison of British troops had been stationed in the rebellious city. At last, one April day in 1775, the news came to Aristopia of that momentous skirmish at Lexington. In little more than 6 weeks after this news had reached the capital of Aristopia, 5,000 well-drilled and well-equipped Aristopian soldiers were ready to embark at Mortonia for Boston, with a battery of 6 12-pounder brass guns. Fearing to encounter some British men of war if they took the passage outside of the Capes, the expedition went by water to the head of Chesapeake Bay, where the soldiers disembarked and marched across to the Delaware. Re-embarking, they went up to Trenton, where they again landed and marched across New Jersey to Paulus Hook, opposite New York City. Embarking again, the expedition passed through Hell Gate into Long Island Sound, and so on to Providence. There they landed and marched to Boston. They approached the Puritan city on the morning of the 17th of June. From a distance they heard the heavy booming of the cannon. They supposed it was only the British vessels bombarding the Patriot fortifications, but as the Aristopians approached nearer, they heard the sharp rattle of musketry and knew that a battle was in progress. The sound quickened and lengthened their pace. Already their commander, General Morton, a great-grandson of Ralph Morton, had received a dispatch from General Putnam, informing him that the British were making a stubborn attack on the works of the Americans and directing his march to Charlestown Neck. The Aristopians received the order, "Double quick march." On went the long column at a trot, to the shrill, lively strains of Yankee Doodle from such of the panting fifers as could keep their breath and their place alongside of the musket-bearers. When the head of the column came near the American redoubt on Breed's Hill, the 1st Regiment swung into line of battle and was halted, with the intention of waiting for the other regiments to come up and form on the left, the column being stretched out about a mile in length. But there was no time to wait. Already the British, on their 3rd charge, had reached the redoubt. The powder of the American militia had given out, and they had no bayonets. The redcoats swarmed over the earthworks. The farmer soldiers resisted a minute or two, using their rifles as clubs, and then fell back. "Forward, march!" was the order that rang out to the Aristopian regiment. Steadily forward went the long blue-coat line of battle, as steadily as ever the red-coat line had come on. Opening their ranks in places to let the retiring militia through, and then quickly closing them again, they moved on to within less than 100 steps of their enemy, when they halted. The long line of muskets came down to a level, and a crashing volley followed. Then down went the musket breeches and up the bayonet points to a charge, and with an impetuous dash the Americans were upon the British, bayonet to bayonet, and instantly the enemy were hurled back over the earthworks. Pausing behind the works to reload, the Aristopians gave their foes another volley. Meanwhile the battery came thundering to the front, and quickly unlimbering on the right and left of the infantry, poured grape upon the broken and retreating line of the British. In a few minutes the other Aristopian regiments came up, and forming on the left, drove the British out of the breastworks of hay and rails stretching down to the Mystic River, which defences had a few minutes before been given up by the farmer soldiers of New Hampshire. Thus the desperate sally of the British ended in utter failure and terrible loss. Then the siege was resumed, and the 6 cannons of the Aristopians were soon hurling their missiles from the heights down upon the British men of war. The Aristopians brought with them a great supply of powder. The supply of the besieging army had become completely exhausted, threatening the failure of the siege. But thenceforth there was no lack, as fresh supplies were hurried forward from Aristopia. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Aristopia by Castello Newton Holford. Let us leave the siege of Boston to view another move in this game of war so briskly opened. But first it should be said that immediately on the publication of the news of the skirmish of Lexington, the Governor-General of Aristopia announced the purpose of the fund which Charles Morton had provided for a great crisis in the history of Aristopia, the War of Independence for the Commonwealth. The crisis had come, the hour had struck. The fund, originally $3 million, which had accumulated by interest to about $7 millions, was to be used by the Commonwealth. It was urged, however, that this fund alone must not be depended on. Aristopia must freely pour out treasure as well as blood, for the struggle would be desperate. England was a stubborn as well as a powerful foe. At the very beginning of the struggle, the government of Aristopia decided that Canada must be conquered, and that Aristopia must do it. It was seen that the British population of Canada, fresh from England and Scotland, would not rebel, and the French population dared not. Canada, held by England, would always form a base of operation against the States, and a safe rendezvous for her fleets. From the St. Lawrence she could harry New England with her soldiers and their Indian allies. By way of Sorrel River and Lake Champlain she could invade New York. From Lake Erie she could threaten Aristopia, although she could never bring force enough to endanger the Commonwealth. In the systematic manner characteristic of the Commonwealth, the enterprise was begun. carefully concealed even from the leaders of the other colonies, even from Washington himself when he was given the chief command of the continental armies. From the head of navigation on the western branch of Allegheny River to the nearest point on the shore of Lake Erie was only 20 miles. Between these two points a good road was constructed. The vessels of the Commonwealth on Lake Michigan were ordered around to Lake Erie. A strong expedition, advancing with celerity and secrecy, captured the unsuspecting British garrison at Fort Niagara. Pressing on, they built a sawmill on a creek near the shore of Lake Ontario. A fort was quickly erected, a shipyard constructed near the mouth of Niagara River, and the building of vessels begun as soon as possible. By great vigilance, supplies sent by the British to Fort Niagara were captured, and information of the shipbuilding on Lake Ontario was prevented from coming to the knowledge of the enemy. All through the summer of 1775 the shipbuilders brought from Boston and Baltimore worked on, with all the assistance which the skilled mechanics and a swarm of labourers from Aristopia could give them. The fleet was to be a strong one, for the Commonwealth determined that no second blow should be needed. The foundries of Aristopia were now turning out as heavy and as good guns as any in the world. These great guns were brought to arm the Ontario fleet. It was a debated point with the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of Aristopia whether the blow should be struck in the fall of 1775 or the spring of 1776, but events decided the matter. Washington himself, ignorant of the designs of Aristopia, determined to send 2 expeditions into Canada to cut off the British supplies. One, commanded by Arnold, went through the wilderness of Maine to capture Quebec. The other, commanded by Montgomery, went by way of Lake Champlain to capture Montreal. Both expeditions started in August. The siege of St. John's, on the Sorrel River, detained Montgomery's force the whole month of September and part of October. At last, the expedition from Aristopia, hastened by these events, left the station on Niagara River about the 1st of October. There were 10 large and heavily armed vessels and some smaller transports. Capturing Kingston at the outlet of Lake Ontario with hardly an effort, the expedition proceeded down the St. Lawrence and arrived at Montreal without obstruction. Montreal was defended by a force of a few hundred men, not expecting a formidable attack. About 2 weeks before the arrival of the Aristopian expedition, the brave and fiery, but eccentric and foolhardy Ethan Allen had attacked the place with only 80 men. He and his little force were quickly captured. But the formidable attack of Aristopia was irresistible, and the British at Montreal immediately surrendered. A strong force was hurried across the country to St. John's, while the Aristopian vessels entered the Sorrel and captured the British vessels sent to relieve St. John's. Carleton, the governor of Canada, made his escape from one of these vessels in a small boat at night, and went to Quebec. The British force at St. John's being captured, the expedition proceeded to Quebec as hastily as possible. The British garrison at that strong point had been warned of the approaching attack, but they were entirely too weak to withstand, even in their stronghold, the combined forces of the Aristopians and General Montgomery. Seeing themselves besieged by a strong fleet on the river and a numerous army on land, with winter near at hand and not the slightest hope of succour from England before spring, the garrison surrendered. Among the prisoners was Governor Carleton. Ethan Allen and his little band were also recaptured. Winter had already begun in that high latitude, and there was nothing further to be done. With the heavy cannons of Aristopia commanding the St. Lawrence from the forts at Quebec, Montreal, and Kingston, and a fleet to aid the forts, invasion of the colonies by England by way of the St. Lawrence was effectually blocked. The Aristopian fleet had brought abundant stores. The French habitants were friendly to the Americans and rejoiced to escape from British dominion. No trouble whatever in holding the country was expected. The force under Montgomery was sent back, in the transports and the vessels captured from the British by way of the Sorrel and Lake Champlain, to New York, carrying to the colonies the first news of the complete conquest of Canada. Toward the middle of November, the expedition under Arnold, in a desperate plight from the hardships they had endured in journeying through the wilderness, half the time without food, exposed to the storms of early winter, arrived at Quebec. Arnold's force was reduced to 750 men, without artillery and with damaged muskets. What would have been the fate of this desperate commander and his few but brave men if the expedition from Aristopia had not come to the rescue can hardly be told. They would certainly have done all that human beings in their circumstances could have done to capture Quebec, but must have perished or been captured in the end. The surprise and joy of the colonies and the consternation of England at the easy conquest of Canada were great. While it was being effected, the British were forced to evacuate Boston. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Aristopia by Castello Newton Holford. It is not the purpose of this work to narrate all the details of the War for Independence. Suffice it to say that during all the war the power and wealth of Aristopia formed the bulwark of the American cause. She realized that the welfare of the other colonies was her interest. Safe from invasion herself, she poured out men and means to repel invasion of the Atlantic colonies. Every port on the Atlantic was defended by great cannons cast in Aristopia, manned by well-trained Aristopian gunners. Everywhere, from the Kennebec to the Savannah, where invasion threatened, there were seen the long blue lines of the brigades of Aristopia, forming a firm nucleus around which might rally, and a sure shield behind which might form the undisciplined and unskilled, if brave and ardent, patriots. The soldiers of Aristopia had not the perfect marksmanship and the self-reliant, fierce, semi-barbaric fighting spirit of the frontiersmen of New York, Virginia, and the Carolinas, which made those men the best skirmishers, sharpshooters, and bushrangers of the world, nor the red-hot zeal, implacable hate, and stubborn courage of the New Englanders. But they had a calm, enduring courage of their own, and they had besides what all the others lacked: steady discipline, willing subordination to their commanders, and skill in the tactics of the line of battle, for they had long been drilled by men who had fought under Frederick the Great. They had, too, the superiority which is ever given by education and intelligence, for Aristopia had for generations been a land of public schools. Of her means, Aristopia gave as freely as of her men. The American armies were armed with Aristopian cannon, muskets, bayonets, and sabres. The mines of Missouri furnished lead, and the caverns of Kentucky the saltpetre from which skilful Aristopian workmen made their powder. The troops were fed largely with flour of wheat from the wood-embosomed fields of Ohio and the prairie farms of Illinois. Ships of war were built by skilful builders at Boston, New York, Baltimore, and Norfolk, and manned by the hardy seamen of the coasts, but Aristopia furnished their cannon, powder, shot, sails, and cordage. The fund furnished by Charles Morton supplied the Commonwealth with the gold and silver needed to pay for all she bought outside of her borders. Inside those borders the public revenues paid for all. The other colonies had followed the example of Aristopia in issuing paper money, but not with the same success, for their paper money depreciated badly, while that of Aristopia was always at par with gold and silver. Her paper money was confined to its proper use as a medium of exchange. That of the other colonies was used as evidence of a debt, the payment of which was very doubtful. In Aristopia, paper money was not, as in the other colonies, an expedient to escape from the pinch of the poverty of to-day by a promise to be met with the hoped-for wealth of to-morrow. In case of a great war, it is common to say, "These burdens are too great for us to bear alone. Let posterity share them, for they are borne as much for the benefit of posterity as for ourselves. Let us go in debt, and let the future pay the debt." The financiers of Aristopia were trained in a wiser school. They knew that most war loans must be procured from usurers and be paid over and over; that the borrowing generation must pay all or more than the debt in interest, and the next generation must pay it in principal, or go on paying it over and over in interest. True, a paper currency offers a means of a forced loan without interest, but at the cost of terribly disordering the medium of exchange. In Aristopia, paper money being issued solely as a medium of exchange, and not as a promise to pay a debt, no more and no less was issued than the wants of trade demanded. The Aristopian paper money was not redeemable in gold, but in what the holders needed more than gold, any of the necessaries or luxuries of life to be had in the market, and it could not depreciate. Every invading fleet and army which England sent over to America was either repelled with great loss to the invaders or captured. Nor was America left to fight her battles alone. The arrogant commercial policy into which England had been driven and kept by the clamours of her hordes of shopkeepers and traders had gained her the enmity of all maritime Europe. Holland was eager to cripple her rival on the seas. France and Spain, although their despotic kings little liked to encourage rebels and republicans in America, could not let slip the opportunity to satisfy their ancient grudges. The result was a triple European alliance against England. England could fight 3 European nations single-handed, but she could do nothing toward conquering America in addition. France, who had so recently lost the greater part of North America, was now determined that England should lose it, and she influenced Spain to a like determination. England could not now hope to gain anything by continuing the war, and had much to lose. Her great commerce was being destroyed. The only alternative was to acknowledge the independence of the American colonies. And to this humiliation the stubborn and dauntless mistress of the seas at last consented. Before the war was ended, the statesmen of Aristopia were considering how they could hold Canada. The French habitants of Lower Canada, including New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, by far the majority of the population of that region, were very willing to exchange the dominion of England for statehood in the American Republic. But a majority of the inhabitants of the province of Ontario were English and Scotch, recent immigrants. They certainly would not have rebelled against England. Whether they would consent to unite with the other colonies was doubtful. Many of them certainly would not. They were few in number, and their majority in the region might be overcome. The Congress of Aristopia made an appropriation to pay the expenses of 10,000 families from Ohio and Allegheny, who consented to go and settle along the northern shores of Lake Erie and Ontario, and on the peninsula opposite Detroit. This completely turned the scale, and it was now certain that a majority of the inhabitants of Upper Canada were in favour of union with the other colonies and independence of Great Britain. The Acadians, remembering with fondness their old home, were induced to return there. Their friendship for Aristopia made them favour a union of Nova Scotia with the other colonies. So, when England objected to giving up Canada on the ground that it had not revolted, but had been overrun by the Americans, a vote of the duly elected legislatures of all the provinces of Canada demanded independence of England and union with the other colonies. End of chapter 24. Conclusion. After the War of Independence, the 6 states of Aristopia rapidly expanded their boundaries and settlements to the Great Lakes on the north and 100 miles south of the Ohio River. The stations on the route to the copper mines and to New Orleans became the germs which quickly grew into new states. Having by far the most desirable and fertile part of the continent, immigration from Europe to Aristopia was much greater than to the Atlantic states, and from her favourable conditions of life, the natural increase of her population was more rapid than that in any other part of America. The Aristopian population dominated the Canadian state of Ontario, and introduced there their peculiar political economy. The other states were at first fearful of a close union with Aristopia, jealous of her overshadowing power. But gradually the leaven of Aristopian political economy worked in the other states, until at last all America, from the Rio Grande to the most northern settlements of Canada, became one solid nation, a Commonwealth in fact as well as in name, whose citizens, safe in their aggregate wealth and power from fear of foreign foes, turned not their fighting force against each other in a social and commercial war, none the less war because other weapons than those of steel and gunpowder were used. Such civil war devastated every other civilized nation of the globe, even when they deceived themselves with the belief that they were enjoying profound peace. In this new nation was realized the dream of the social philosophers and philanthropists of all ages, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, resting on the deep and solid foundations of liberty, equality, and fraternity. End of Aristopia by Castello Newton Holford.